Welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every case challenges your intellect, every clue sharpens your instincts, and every mystery pulls you deeper into the unknown. Grab a seat, stay sharp, and let's unravel the truth together. Sherlock Holmes and the Letter from the Future. Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Impossible Letter. The morning was swallowed in mist, a thick, ghostly veil that clung to the cobbled streets of London, muffling the usual clatter of carriages and distant cries of street vendors. From my seat by the fire, in 221B Baker Street, I observed the world beyond the rain-streaked window, where the gas lamps flickered weakly against the pressing fog, their glow barely piercing the heavy air. Holmes, reclining in his chair opposite me, gazed absently at the ceiling, fingers steepled in his customary fashion. It was a rare morning of quiet, undisturbed by telegrams, visitors, or peculiar mysteries demanding our attention. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting. "You feel it too, Watson?" Holmes's voice cut through the silence, his grey eyes flicking toward me. I frowned. "Feel what, Holmes?" "The stillness, the unnatural hush of the city." His gaze drifted toward the window, narrowing slightly. "There is a tension in the air, an anticipation. A mystery is approaching." I chuckled, setting down my tea. "A premonition, Holmes? You surprise me." He smiled faintly, but said nothing more. And then, as if summoned by his words, the sharp rap of knuckles against our door shattered the quiet. The knock was urgent, 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. Not the confident summons of a man seeking casual conversation, but the desperate plea of one standing on the precipice of something terrible. I rose swiftly and pulled open the door. The man who stood on our threshold was pale, his eyes shadowed and wild, as though he had not slept in days. He was dressed in a respectable yet dishevelled manner, his greatcoat wrinkled, his cravat loosened. In his gloved hands, clutched as though it might vanish if he loosened his grip, was a single envelope. "Dr. Watson." "Mr. Holmes," he croaked, his voice dry and trembling. I beg of you, help me." Holmes, already watching him with keen scrutiny, gestured toward the chair beside the fire. "Come in, Mr. Forsyth," the man said hastily, stepping inside as though fearful the fog itself might follow him. "Elias Forsyth." As I closed the door behind him, Holmes motioned toward the envelope in Forsyth's trembling hands. "And what, Mr. Forsyth, has reduced you to such a state of distress?" Forsyth swallowed, licking his dry lips. He hesitated, then extended the envelope toward Holmes, as though reluctant to part with it. "This," he whispered hoarsely. "This letter. It should not exist." Holmes took the envelope delicately between his fingertips, his sharp gaze sweeping over it. I leaned in beside him. The paper was aged, yellowed at the edges, as though it had sat for years in some forgotten drawer. But it was not the condition of the envelope that made my breath catch. It was the postmark, dated precisely 2 weeks in the future. Holmes turned the envelope over with care, his expression unreadable. The wax seal bore an elegant F, the unmistakable mark of Forsyth himself. I met Forsyth's gaze. "This is your seal?" He nodded hastily. "Yes, and the handwriting, it is mine as well, but I swear upon my life, I have never written this letter." Holmes's thumb ran over the wax seal, then up to the postmark. His eyes flickered with something akin to curiosity. "Where did you find this?" "On my desk this morning," Forsyth whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I was alone last night, no visitors, no deliveries, and yet, when I awoke, there it sat, as though it had always been there." Holmes said nothing as he reached for his penknife and, with practiced precision, sliced the envelope open. He withdrew a single sheet of parchment, unfolding it with care. The ink was slightly faded, yet the handwriting, undeniably Forsyth's, remained clear. Holmes's eyes flicked over the words. Then he read aloud. At the stroke of midnight, death will claim me. There is no escape. A shiver ran through me, despite the warmth of the fire. Forsyth let out a ragged breath, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. Holmes lowered the letter, glancing at our visitor. "You are certain you did not write this?" Forsyth's gaze was hollow. "I swear it, Mr. Holmes, but look at the date." "I did." My breath caught. The letter was dated for tonight. A silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece seemed louder, more deliberate, each second dragging toward the inevitability written on that page. Holmes sat forward, folding the letter neatly before setting it upon the table. "Let us establish the facts. This is, by all appearances, your handwriting, your seal, your paper. Yet you claim you did not write it." "I did not." Forsyth's hands clenched into fists. "I have no explanation for how it came to be." Holmes exhaled slowly. "And yet, Mr. Forsyth, it is written with a certainty that suggests knowledge. If not your own, then someone else's. You say you were alone last night. Who else has access to your study?" Forsyth hesitated. "Only my butler, Grayson. But he would never—" Holmes lifted a single finger, silencing him. His gaze had darkened, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Your estate. Has there been any disturbance? Anything out of place?" Forsyth hesitated. But—" He swallowed. "This is not the first time." Watson and I exchanged glances. Forsyth's voice dropped to a whisper. "I have received another letter like this before." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "When?" "3 months ago," Forsyth admitted. "It warned of something I ignored. And yet, it came to pass." The flickering firelight cast shadows across the room, making Forsyth's face appear gaunt, haunted. Holmes exhaled, standing abruptly. "Watson, we must prepare. Tonight we shall keep watch over Mr. Forsyth's home. If fate is truly at play, we must be there to meet it." Watson shifted uneasily. "And if it is not fate?" Holmes's gaze flickered toward the letter once more. "Then, Watson, we are dealing with a mind that understands how to make men believe in it." The clock struck 9. In 3 hours, midnight would arrive. And with it, perhaps, death itself. Holmes turned the letter over in his hands, his expression one of measured intrigue. The edges of the paper were slightly yellowed, its fibres rough with age, yet the ink, though faded in places, remained unmistakably legible. He began to read. "At the stroke of midnight, death will claim me. There is no escape." A cold stillness settled over the room. I felt the breath leave me, as if the very walls of 221B Baker Street had drawn in closer, enclosing us within the weight of those terrible words. The handwriting was unquestionably Forsyth's, the very signature at the bottom mirroring the one scrawled in nervous haste across our visitor's own trembling fingers. Forsyth's hands clenched the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, his face drained of colour. "I did not write that letter, Mr. Holmes." His voice was hoarse, brittle as old parchment. Holmes did not look up. Instead, he ran his fingertips lightly over the ink, the pressure of his touch no more than a whisper against the paper. "Curious," he murmured. "Curious," I echoed. "Holmes, the man is being threatened by himself." Holmes glanced at me then, his grey eyes unreadable. "Then tell me, Watson, how does a man receive a letter from his own hand before he has written it?" He placed the letter upon the desk, shifting his focus to the envelope from which it had been withdrawn. The wax seal remained intact, its edges unbroken until Holmes had sliced it open mere moments ago. Forsyth shuddered. "It was exactly as you see it now when I found it this morning, sealed, untouched." Holmes lifted the envelope toward the light of the fireplace, his sharp gaze flicking over the faint discolorations along its edges. He ran his fingers over the postmark. This was stamped at the Central Post Office, he noted. A genuine mark, not a forgery. I stepped forward. Then what are you suggesting? Holmes exhaled softly. Not yet, Watson. First, the ink. He took a magnifying lens from his inner coat pocket, holding it just above the signature. A flicker of interest passed over his face, almost too fleeting to notice. The ink is aged, he muttered, but not by time. I frowned. What do you mean? Holmes straightened, fixing Forsyth with a piercing gaze. Mr. Forsyth, do you own any chemical solutions in your home? Anything that might artificially age documents? Forsyth shook his head violently. No! Why would I? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together in thought. Everything about this letter suggests authenticity. And yet, it should not exist. The seal was unbroken, the ink appears old, and the postmark is genuine. His voice dropped slightly, as though speaking more to himself than to us. Someone wishes for you to believe that fate has taken pen in hand, Mr. Forsyth. But fate is an unskilled forger. Forsyth's breaths were shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick succession. His gaze darted between us, pleading, searching. You don't understand, he whispered. This has happened before. I stiffened. Before. Forsyth's head moved in a slow, trembling nod. 3 months ago, I received another letter, just like this one. It warned me of... He faltered. It warned me of something I could not believe, so I ignored it. I felt a chill creep along my spine. And did it come true? He looked away. Yes. I turned to Holmes, expecting to find some measure of skepticism in his expression. But he was watching Forsyth carefully, his fingers pressed together in contemplation. This belief you hold, Mr. Forsyth, he said finally, it is a dangerous thing. Forsyth blinked. Belief? Holmes nodded, leaning forward. Belief has ended more lives than steel. It is the most insidious of poisons, for once it has entered the mind, it spreads without resistance. Forsyth swallowed. Then you... He hesitated. You do not think the letter is real? Holmes gave a small, sharp smile. Oh, the letter is real, Mr. Forsyth, but the future is unwritten. The clock upon the mantelpiece chimed the hour, 9 o'clock. The sound rang through the quiet room, marking the passage of time with an ominous finality. Watson turned toward the window, peering into the thickening fog that had settled over Baker Street. The lamps outside burned weakly, their glow barely illuminating the swirling mist. In just 3 hours, he muttered, midnight will come. Forsyth sat motionless, his fingers still curled into the fabric of his coat. His face was cast in half shadow, the firelight flickering against his pale features. Holmes rose abruptly. Then we must move quickly. Watson, gather your coat. I hesitated. We are going somewhere. Indeed. Holmes turned toward Forsyth. You will take us to your home, Mr. Forsyth. If fate truly intends to strike at midnight, then let us be present to witness it. Forsyth's lips parted in silent protest, but no words came. He simply nodded. Holmes reached for his coat, his voice calm but firm. We shall see if destiny is as unyielding as you believe. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the city in shadows, and somewhere in the unseen night, midnight loomed ever closer. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. Shadows of the past. The carriage wheels rattled against the uneven cobblestones, the sound muffled by the dense fog that coiled around the gas-lit streets of London. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp was swallowed by the mist before it could cast its glow upon us. Holmes sat in silence, his sharp profile barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the carriage window. His fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his keen mind no doubt constructing the architecture of the enigma before us. I pulled my coat tighter around my frame, glancing toward him. Forsyth's house. What do you expect to find there? Holmes did not look at me. Instead, his voice, low and measured, cut through the damp air. A man's home often reveals more than he ever will. The meaning of his words hung between us as the carriage turned onto a long, deserted lane. Through the veil of fog, the silhouette of Forsyth's estate emerged, a hulking spectre of stone and shadow, its towers vanishing into the mist as though swallowed by time itself. The iron gate stood ajar. The wind, whispering through the trees, sent a slow, mournful creak through the rusted hinges as they swung open. As we stepped from the carriage, I could not shake the sensation that we were being watched. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper, melted wax, and a lingering mustiness that suggested rooms long untouched. A single candle flickered weakly atop a polished wooden table in the entrance hall, its flames struggling against the oppressive darkness that lurked in the corners. The furniture, though once grand, was coated in a fine layer of dust, as though time itself had hesitated here. Holmes moved forward, his footsteps nearly soundless upon the Persian rug. His eyes roved over the portraits lining the walls, their gilded frames dulled by years of neglect. Faces, some stern, some sorrowful, stared back, their eyes watchful, unreadable. A single tick-tock echoed through the chamber, the measured, deliberate sound of a grandfather clock standing tall in the hallway. The pendulum swayed, marking the passage of moments that Forsyth no longer owned. A creak upon the staircase. I turned sharply, my pulse quickening. But there was nothing, only the empty, yawning corridor that stretched upward, vanishing into shadow. Holmes, however, had stilled. His head was tilted slightly, listening. After a moment, he spoke, his voice no louder than a breath. "We are not alone." The drawing room was dimly lit, the fire in the hearth burning low, casting shifting shadows across the high-backed chairs and dark oak furnishings. 3 figures stood within, each one a potential keeper of secrets. Miss Eleanor Forsyth stood nearest to the fireplace, the flickering light reflecting in her wary eyes. She was a woman of sharp features and delicate frame, but there was something guarded in her stance, as though she had built walls around herself long before this night. Holmes turned to her first. "Miss Forsyth, I presume?" She nodded, but her fingers twitched where they rested against the arm of the chair. "You must forgive the state of the house," she said. "We have had little time to prepare for visitors." "Grief is a difficult custodian," Holmes replied smoothly. "Yet I suspect your discomfort has little to do with mourning and more to do with what you have not yet told us." Eleanor stiffened. "I do not know what you mean." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Do you?" Before she could respond, another voice cut through the room, a low, skeptical drawl. "Surely, Mr. Holmes, you do not entertain this absurdity." I turned toward the speaker, Dr. Alistair Harrow, a man of rigid posture and colder demeanour. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked between Holmes and Forsyth's desk, where the infamous letter had been found. "This business with the letters," Harrow continued, "is nothing more than the delusions of a troubled mind. Forsyth was not well." Holmes regarded him for a moment. "And you, Doctor, how well did you know his mind?" Harrow's lips curled slightly. "As well as any physician knows the mind of his patient." "A physician," Holmes mused, "or a friend?" "Both," Harrow replied, his tone carefully neutral. Holmes smiled faintly, but did not press the matter. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the third occupant of the room, Mr. Grayson, the butler. The man stood near the doorway, his hands clasped before him. His face was unreadable, his demeanour practiced. Holmes studied him for a moment. "Tell me, Grayson, did Mr. Forsyth often receive letters he had not written?" The butler did not move, but something, a flicker of hesitation, passed over his face before he spoke. "I cannot say, sir." Holmes tilted his head slightly. Ah, a careful answer, but not a truthful one. Grayson's hands tightened around each other. I serve this house, sir. That is all. Holmes did not look away. And yet, even the silent observe. A long pause stretched between them before Grayson finally exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. This is not the first letter of its kind, Mr. Holmes. The room grew colder. Miss Eleanor's breath caught. Dr. Harrow stiffened. Holmes, however, only nodded. I rather suspected it was not. The air in Forsyth's study was thick with the scent of old parchment and the lingering smoke of an extinguished candle. The atmosphere seemed to carry the weight of its former occupant's final moments, as though the very walls had absorbed his terror. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the immaculate desk, the neat rows of books lining the shelves, the unbroken layer of dust on the windowsill. Yet his keen eyes found something out of place. A meticulous man, was he? Holmes murmured, glancing at Eleanor. She hesitated before nodding. Elias despised disorder. Holmes's fingers ghosted over the surface of the desk before halting at one corner. He pressed down slightly, then lifted his fingers. A faint smudge of displaced dust marred the otherwise pristine wood. This, he said quietly, was disturbed. Watson frowned. The desk? But everything appears. Too perfect, Holmes interjected. Someone made an effort to return things precisely as they were. He crouched by the window latch, tracing his finger along the edge. A smudge of dust, yet the latch remains locked. He straightened. Someone has been in this room, Watson, but they left no footprints. I felt the hairs on my neck rise. Impossible, I muttered. Holmes exhaled, stepping back. Nothing is impossible, merely improbable, until explained. He turned, his gaze settling on Eleanor. Tell me, Miss Forsyth, was your cousin prone to receiving unsettling correspondence? A long pause. Then, Eleanor's hands tightened around the folds of her dress. Yes, she whispered. This wasn't the first. Holmes said nothing, merely waited. The crackling fire cast shifting shadows across the floor as Eleanor hesitated, then moved toward the small cabinet near the bookcase. She withdrew a single yellowed envelope, its seal broken, its edges curled with age. This arrived 3 months ago, she said. He never spoke of it again. Holmes took the envelope, studying the ink. The handwriting was Forsyth's, but the date was 3 months prior. He unfolded the letter and read aloud. The fog watches. He is waiting. I see him even when I close my eyes. A chill swept through me. I found myself glancing toward the window, though I knew the fog outside revealed nothing. Forsyth had dismissed this warning, and now he was dead. Holmes looked up sharply, his eyes flashing in the firelight. Dr. Harrow stood tense, his fingers clenched at his sides. You knew about this, didn't you, Doctor? Harrow scoffed. What are you implying, Holmes? Holmes said nothing, but the way he watched Harrow, silent, unblinking, sent an undeniable message. The hour crept closer to midnight. The household had retired for the evening, but none of us expected sleep. There was a palpable weight in the air, an unspoken tension that pressed upon the walls. I sat in the drawing room beside the fire, yet I felt no warmth. My mind turned over the strange events of the evening, the letters that should not have existed, the smudges in the study that should not have been disturbed. A candle flickered, the shadows along the walls elongated, stretching unnaturally, a faint creak upon the floorboards. I turned my head sharply. The corridor beyond the room was empty. Holmes, seated in his chair, had not moved, but I saw the way his fingers had curled slightly around the armrest. He had heard it too. Someone is awake, I murmured. Holmes did not reply, but his sharp grey eyes did not leave the darkened hallway. Then, the clock began to chime. The grandfather clock struck midnight. A single note. Then another. The deep resonance of the chimes filled the house, lingering in the air like an omen. Then, a scream. a terrible, ragged scream filled with fear and finality. I was on my feet before the echoes had faded. Holmes had already moved, striding toward the corridor with a singular urgency. The sound had come from the study. The door stood slightly ajar, the glow of candlelight flickering from within. Holmes pushed it open. Elias Forsyth was slumped over his desk, motionless. A knife protruded from his back, its hilt gleaming dully in the firelight. His lifeless fingers rested against yet another letter, his final message written in his own hand. The room fell into a terrible, unnatural silence. Holmes exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. Fate, Watson, or something far more sinister? Chapter 3. The paradox unfolds. A murder foretold. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, each measured beat, counting away the seconds since the impossible had been made real. The air was thick with the metallic tang of spilled blood, mingling with the fading scent of candle smoke. Elias Forsyth lay slumped over his desk, his face turned away, as if in sleep. But there was no breath, no movement, only the dagger protruding from his back, gleaming in the flickering firelight. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. The sight was grotesquely surreal. It defied every law of logic. He had died exactly as the letter had foretold. Miss Eleanor gave a strangled gasp, stumbling back against the armchair as though the air had been robbed from her lungs. Dr. Harrow, his face devoid of colour, whispered in stunned disbelief, "Impossible." It was written, and so it has come to pass. Holmes, however, remained unshaken. While the others recoiled in horror, he moved forward, his sharp gaze flicking over every detail with the precision of a man dismantling an intricate puzzle. I swallowed hard. Holmes, there was no one else in this house. No intruder. No sign of forced entry. How? Holmes knelt beside the corpse, his long fingers hovering just above the hilt of the knife. No forced entry, no struggle. And yet, a man lies dead. He exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Fascinating. Holmes rose, his movements deliberate, and reached for a crumpled sheet of paper lying beneath Forsyth's lifeless hand. He carefully unfolded it, the faintly aged ink glistening in the dim light. I stepped closer, a chill running down my spine as my eyes traced the words. At the stroke of midnight, death will claim me. There is no escape. The handwriting was unmistakably Forsyth's, the same sharp strokes, the same precise curves of each letter. And yet, he had never written it. My throat was dry. Holmes, this defies all logic. Holmes's lips twitched into a faint, knowing smile. No, Watson, he murmured. It is logic that will unravel this deception. His gaze swept over the room, the overturned inkwell on the desk, the undisturbed dust along the windowsill, the way Forsyth's body had collapsed forward rather than to the side. He was already seeing what I could not. Behind us, Miss Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes wide with something between terror and sorrow. Dr. Harrow stood still as a statue, his expression unreadable. And then there was Grayson, the ever-silent butler, his lips pressed into a thin, colourless line. Holmes let the letter fall to the desk and straightened, his voice calm yet firm. Someone here, he said, knows far more than they are admitting. Miss Eleanor's composure shattered. He knew, she sobbed, clutching at the edge of the desk as though it might anchor her to reality. He knew he was going to die, and none of us stopped it. Holmes observed her quietly, though his gaze held neither pity nor comfort. Dr. Harrow turned away, his hands shaking as he poured himself a measure of brandy from the sideboard. He downed it in a single swallow, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. I should have insisted he see a physician, he muttered. His mind, he was unravelling, talking of things he could not explain, letters that should not exist. Holmes arched an eyebrow. And yet, Doctor, when I asked earlier, You dismissed the notion entirely. Why the sudden change of heart? Harrow's fingers tensed around the empty glass, but he said nothing. And then there was Grayson. The butler stood at attention, his posture rigid, unnaturally still. Of all those present, he alone had not spoken a single word. Holmes turned to him. "And you, Grayson? You seem remarkably unshaken by your employer's passing." The butler's gaze remained fixed on the floor. "It is not my place to react, sir." Holmes stepped forward, his sharp eyes glinting. "No, and yet I find your silence more telling than any outburst." The tension in the room was suffocating. Holmes let the silence stretch, watching them all carefully. Then, finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time, measured, deliberate. "This is not a case of prophecy," he said. "This is a case of murder." Holmes reached forward and wrapped his fingers around the hilt of the knife, his movements slow, deliberate. The blade glinted in the dim candlelight, its crimson-stained steel a stark contrast against Forsyth's unmoving form. With a measured pull, he drew it free from the body. A faint, wet sound filled the room, a noise that made Miss Eleanor shudder. Watson exhaled. "That knife," he hesitated. "It belongs to Forsyth, does it not?" Holmes turned the weapon over in his hand, his sharp gaze tracing the details of the handle. The wood was old, well worn, its grip smooth from years of use. "It does," Holmes murmured. Watson frowned. "But why use a weapon already in the house?" Holmes's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Because, Watson, the illusion of an external killer must be preserved." He set the knife carefully upon the desk and produced a small brush from his pocket, running it lightly over the handle. The bristles glided over the surface, searching, hoping for any trace of another. Moments passed. Then Holmes straightened. "Only Forsyth's prints," he said softly. The implications hung heavy in the air. Watson shook his head. "Then you mean to say—" "I mean to say that Elias Forsyth was murdered," Holmes interrupted. "But the hands that guided him to his death never once touched the blade." Holmes turned his attention toward Forsyth's stiffening fingers. Death had already begun its slow claim, locking his grip around something clutched tightly in his hand. With practiced ease, Holmes pried open the rigid fingers, revealing another envelope, its paper crinkled but untouched by blood. Silence fell over the room. Watson leaned in, feeling an inexplicable chill crawl up his spine. The date on the envelope was tomorrow. Miss Eleanor let out a strangled sound. That cannot be. Holmes, undeterred, slid his knife through the seal and unfolded the letter. His expression remained unreadable as his eyes skimmed over the words. Then he read aloud. "The truth is hidden where the past and the future meet." A chill settled into Watson's bones. Dr. Harrow exhaled sharply, his skepticism breaking through. More riddles? Or did Forsyth write that after he was already dead? Holmes folded the letter carefully, placing it beside the first. He studied the room, his gaze flicking from one uneasy face to the next. "This," he said finally, "is no riddle. This is design." No one spoke. But the silence was no longer empty. It was heavy. It was watching. Dr. Harrow let out a harsh laugh, the sound brittle, forced. "This is absurd." He gestured toward the letters, the body, the very room itself. "A man writes letters predicting his own death. You expect me to believe in ghosts and prophecies?" Eleanor, pale but resolute, stared him down. "Then how do you explain this?" Dr. Harrow opened his mouth, then shut it again. Holmes remained impassive, watching them both with quiet amusement. Watson cleared his throat. His voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Holmes, is this even possible?" Holmes turned toward him, and for the first time that evening, there was no trace of mirth in his expression. "Nothing is impossible, Watson," he said, "but everything is explainable." His words should have been reassuring. They were not. Watson woke to the faint crackling of a dying fire. For a brief, disoriented moment, he forgot where he was, until the weight of the previous night's horrors came rushing back. Forsyth was dead. The letter had foretold it. And Holmes. Holmes sat before the fireplace, his gaze distant, the glow of the embers casting flickering shadows across his sharp features. Something was wrong. Watson sat up, his eyes searching the room. And then he saw it. The letter was gone. He inhaled sharply. Holmes. I know. Holmes did not look away from the fire. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, something cold, calculated. Watson swallowed. Burned. Holmes nodded. Watson turned toward the others. Eleanor, Harrow, Grayson. Their faces were unreadable. Holmes finally stood, his sharp gaze sweeping over them. Which of you destroyed the evidence? No one spoke, but guilt hung heavy in the air. The case had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Fate. A House of Lies. The parlour was dimly lit, the fire in the hearth reduced to smouldering embers, casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. The house, once filled with the weight of Forsyth's anxieties, now held something darker, a suffocating, inescapable tension. Holmes sat in the grand chair, his fingertips pressed together in his customary pose of contemplation. His gaze swept across the room, taking in each occupant with a meticulous patience that was, in itself, an interrogation. Miss Eleanor Forsyth sat rigid, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her fingers clenching the fabric as though it were the only thing anchoring her. She avoided Holmes's gaze. Dr. Harrow lounged back in his chair, his posture one of studied indifference, but Watson noted the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers curled against the armrest, a silent betrayal of his unease. Grayson, the butler, stood near the window, his back almost too straight, his hands clasped too tightly, watching the fog roll against the glass. Holmes let the silence stretch, tapping his fingers against the arm of the chair in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Then, finally, he spoke. One of you knows the truth. The words, though spoken softly, struck the room like a gunshot. Eleanor flinched. Harrow exhaled sharply. Grayson said nothing. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a murmur. Forsyth was not a man destined for death. He was guided to it, and I intend to uncover the hand that led him there. The air in the room seemed to tighten, coil inward. No one moved. Holmes's gaze settled on Eleanor. And I believe, he continued, that we should begin with you, Miss Forsyth. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her shawl, her breath faltering for the briefest moment. Holmes watched her keenly, his voice smooth, almost conversational. Miss Forsyth, you are now the sole heir to this estate, are you not? She hesitated. I do not know the details of my cousin's affairs. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. He placed it on the table before her with deliberate care. Watson recognized it at once, a will. Holmes spoke, his voice as sharp as the scalpel Watson used in his medical practice. Forsyth updated his will mere weeks ago, naming you as his sole beneficiary. There is no other family, no other claimants. Eleanor paled. Her lips pressed together into a thin, bloodless line. Curious, is it not? Holmes continued. A man receives letters predicting his demise, grows increasingly unhinged, and, as though fate had indeed written his end, dies, leaving you everything. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the document, her eyes darting over the page. I did not know of this, she whispered. Holmes studied her face. And yet, Miss Forsyth, your expression tells me otherwise. Watson shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between them. He wanted to believe Eleanor, but doubt had begun to coil itself around the edges of his certainty. Eleanor finally raised her eyes to Holmes. Do you truly believe I would kill my own cousin? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon Dr. Harrow. "Perhaps not," he murmured. "But I believe you are not the only one with something to lose." Dr. Harrow had remained silent during Holmes's exchange with Eleanor, but now his jaw tightened, his posture no longer quite so relaxed. Holmes reached into his coat once more and withdrew a small, battered leather ledger. He turned it over in his hands before sliding it across the table. Harrow's fingers twitched, but he did not reach for it. "Where did you find that?" His voice was flat, but there was something beneath it, something unnerved. Watson hesitated, then flipped the ledger open. His eyes widened. "These are Forsyth's financial records," he murmured. "Indeed," Holmes said, almost idly. "But look closer, Watson. The figures, do they strike you as peculiar?" Watson turned the pages. The numbers did not match. Transactions were misrecorded. Amounts shifted. It was subtle, carefully done, but it was there. Holmes studied Harrow. "It appears, Doctor, that you had a vested interest in Forsyth's declining sanity." Eleanor turned sharply toward Harrow. "What is he saying?" Harrow's lips parted, but no words came. Holmes continued, relentless. "Your records show payments that never reach their intended destinations, sums that do not align. Forsyth trusted you, Harrow. You were his physician, his confidant, and yet you used that trust to bleed him dry." Harrow exhaled sharply, slamming his fist onto the arm of the chair. "This is nonsense." Holmes tilted his head. "Is it?" Watson, still poring over the ledger, muttered, "Holmes, these inconsistencies, they go back over a year." Eleanor looked ill. "You stole from him." Harrow pushed himself to his feet. "I ensured he had what he needed. Forsyth was losing his mind. Anyone could see that." Holmes remained seated, his voice unshaken. "And yet, Doctor, you were remarkably eager to dismiss his claims of the letters, perhaps because you needed them to appear as the ramblings of a man already lost to paranoia." The room was silent. Then, a soft, bitter chuckle escaped Harrow's lips. "You believe I killed him?" Holmes's gaze did not waver. "I believe you needed him to fall apart, whether or not you guided his hand to his death." He exhaled slowly. "That is what remains to be seen." Holmes turned his sharp gaze to Grayson, the butler, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. His posture was unwaveringly rigid, his expression blank, too blank. "You, sir," Holmes said at last, his voice smooth, deliberate, "seem curiously unaffected by the death of your employer." Grayson did not flinch. "A butler does not indulge in sentiment, Mr. Holmes." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, sensing the shift. Something unsaid hung in the air, thick and heavy. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the arm of the chair. "No, I rather think it is something else." He paused, letting the silence coil around his words before he continued. "This is not the first letter of its kind, is it, Grayson?" A flicker of something, not fear, not surprise, but a quiet, resigned acknowledgement, passed over the butler's face. He inhaled deeply before nodding. "Indeed, sir." His voice was steady. "It is not." Watson sat forward. "You mean Forsyth had received other warnings?" Grayson's fingers twitched against his coat. "Yes, and each time he dismissed them as paranoia." Holmes's eyes narrowed. And yet this time, the letter was right. The fire crackled, its embers casting flickering shadows along the walls. The weight of those words pressed upon them all. Holmes rose suddenly, his movements precise, purposeful. He strode toward Forsyth's desk, his fingers gliding over its smooth mahogany surface. Watson watched as Holmes's hands moved, not randomly, but with the assurance of a man who already knew what he sought. "Something has been concealed here," Holmes murmured. He ran his fingertips along the edge of the desk, pressing lightly at seemingly ordinary places. Then, With a sharp click, a hidden panel beneath the drawer shifted. A shallow compartment slid open. Inside lay dozens of letters, each neatly folded, their edges yellowed with time. Watson exhaled sharply. Good heavens, Holmes, these are all from him. Holmes lifted one, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elias Forsyth's. Holmes read aloud, his voice low. I have seen him in the fog. He stands at a distance, watching. Always watching. Another letter, dated weeks later. The future is already written. I cannot change its course. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with horror. Watson swallowed hard. But why? Why would Forsyth write these letters to himself? Holmes studied the words, his expression dark. It seems Forsyth was not merely a recipient. He turned to face the room, his voice as cold as the London mist outside. He was the author of his own fate. The room stood still. The letters sat between them like an accusation, their meaning twisting, warping in Watson's mind. He felt the creeping tendrils of doubt, the kind that gnawed at the edges of logic. But the ink, Watson murmured. The paper, they were aged. How could he have written them in advance? Eleanor, pale, whispered, what if the past and future are intertwined? Dr. Harrow let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. You cannot be serious. Watson, the eternal man of science, would have agreed. And yet, the evidence sat before him. Could time truly be at play? For the first time since the case began, Watson felt the certainty in his own mind waver. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. He placed the letter down, folding his hands before him. No, he said firmly. There is no paradox here, only deception. And yet, as he spoke those words, even Holmes did not glance toward the darkened hallway behind them. The fire flickered. A silence fell over the room, heavy and unnatural, as though the house itself had begun to listen. Then, a shift. Not a sound, not an outright movement, but a presence. Watson's breath caught in his throat as his gaze flicked to the doorway. A shadow stood just beyond the threshold, a figure, watching. Holmes moved swiftly, striding toward the door and flinging it open. But the corridor was empty. The air was still, save for the distant creak of the house settling. Watson stepped forward, his pulse still pounding. Holmes? Holmes did not move. His gaze swept the hallway, his sharp mind calculating, absorbing, dissecting. Then at last he spoke, his voice quiet. Someone is listening. Chapter 5. The Mastermind Revealed. The Final Move. The mansion was silent, oppressive. The storm that had threatened the night before had not broken, but the air was thick with the scent of rain waiting to fall. Every breath felt heavier, as though the house itself was bracing for what was to come. Holmes stood by the fireplace, his profile illuminated by the restless dance of the flames. His eyes, sharp as cut glass, remained fixed upon them all, the scattered remnants of a house that had, for too long, been ruled by fear. Watson shifted uneasily. Holmes, he murmured. Are you certain of this? Holmes did not answer at first. He merely watched the fire, its embers glowing like dying stars. Then at last, he spoke. Quite. His voice was calm, sharp, unyielding. We are dealing with a mind that does not kill in the conventional sense. It does not strike with blade or poison. He turned his gaze toward Watson. No, my friend. It manipulates belief itself. The words sent a chill through Watson that no fire could warm. Miss Eleanor shifted in her chair, glancing toward the window where the fog curled against the glass. Dr. Harrow remained motionless, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. Grayson, ever the silent observer, watched from the shadows. The trap was set. Now they waited. Holmes moved to the desk. The infamous letter, the one Forsyth had received from the future, lay before him. With careful precision, he lifted a small vial from his coat pocket and uncorked it. The scent of chemicals filled the air, sharp and acrid. Watson furrowed his brow. "Holmes, what is that?" "A simple reagent, Watson," Holmes replied, dabbing a cloth with the substance. "One that will reveal whether this ink is as aged as it claims to be." He pressed the cloth to the letter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the edges of the ink began to dissolve. Watson inhaled sharply as the carefully crafted illusion began to unravel. The false age of the letter, the premature fading, all an intricate deception. "Brilliant," Holmes murmured. He held the paper up to the light, his eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. A chemical compound designed to give the ink an artificial appearance of age. When applied subtly, it can deceive even the most skeptical eye. A heavy silence followed. Then Holmes turned his gaze to Dr. Harrow. "You knew Forsyth would believe what his eyes told him," Holmes said, his voice soft but cutting. "You knew that a man who already feared the inescapability of fate would not question a prophecy that aligned with his worst terrors." Harrow did not move, but Watson saw it, the briefest flicker of something in his expression, a momentary tension in his fingers. Holmes smiled. "The mind, Doctor, is a far deadlier weapon than any blade." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew an old, yellowed newspaper clipping. He unfolded it carefully, his voice smooth as silk as he read aloud. "Reginald Fairchild, age 26, found dead in his study. The cause, self-inflicted wounds. The incident, later ruled as accidental, has left the Fairchild estate in the hands of his business partner, Elias Forsyth." The room shuddered with the weight of those words. Eleanor's breath hitched. "That name," she whispered. "Forsyth never spoke of him, but I heard whispers." "A name Forsyth wished to forget," Holmes interrupted, his gaze landing once more on Dr. Harrow. "Tell me, Doctor, how does a suicide become an accident?" Harrow's fingers twitched, but still, he did not speak. Holmes stepped forward. Reginald Fairchild was Forsyth's friend, was he not? And yet, one night, he was found dead. A convenient accident. An accident that left Forsyth with everything. Eleanor's hands trembled. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," Holmes cut in, his voice now low and deliberate, "that someone in this house remembered that night, and they used it against Forsyth. They knew he would crumble beneath its weight. They knew how to turn paranoia into certainty." Harrow finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Then he met Holmes's gaze. "Do you have proof, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes smiled. "I do not need proof," he said softly, "because you just gave it to me." Holmes stood before them, his expression impassive, yet there was a glint of finality in his gaze. The truth had long been lurking in the shadows. Now it was time to drag it into the light. "Forsyth wasn't killed," Holmes said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "He was guided." Watson frowned. "But the knife—" "A necessary detail to complete the illusion," Holmes interrupted. "The truth, Watson, is far more insidious. Forsyth's mind was the true murder weapon." A slow exhale from across the room. Dr. Harrow. His carefully composed demeanour had begun to fracture. His eyes, dark and unreadable, studied Holmes with the caution of a man who knew the game was ending. "You planted the letters," Holmes continued, stepping closer. "You ensured his growing paranoia. You whispered doubts, nudged his fears, and orchestrated a reality where the impossible seemed inevitable." His voice lowered. "And when the moment arrived, you let Forsyth convince himself that fate was inescapable." Watson swallowed hard, his mind reeling at the implications. "He took his own life," Watson whispered, realization dawning, "thinking he had no choice." Holmes nodded. "Because you, Dr. Harrow, made certain he believed it." A long silence. Then, A soft chuckle, measured, unrushed. Dr. Harrow slowly straightened, his eyes flickering with something between amusement and admiration. Magnificent, he murmured. To be outplayed by Sherlock Holmes. Eleanor gasped, horror lining her delicate features. You drove him to it? Harrow's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. I merely showed him the path, he said. It was he who chose to walk it. Watson felt a wave of revulsion rise within him. You played with a man's sanity. His voice shook with anger. You led him to his death. He was already halfway there, Harrow cut in, his tone calm, almost detached. His mind was fragile. His past haunted him. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Encouraged the inevitable. Watson clenched his fists, but Holmes remained unnervingly calm. And yet, Holmes said, tilting his head slightly, you miscalculated one thing, Doctor. Harrow's expression shifted, just slightly. Holmes stepped toward the desk. The air in the room tightened. With deliberate slowness, Holmes pulled open the desk drawer and retrieved a sealed envelope. You thought you erased all evidence of your motive, Holmes said smoothly. You thought the trail was buried with Forsyth's mind. He turned the envelope in his hands, then broke the seal. But Forsyth kept one thing. From within, Holmes pulled out a document. A contract. Eleanor inhaled sharply. What is that? Holmes unfolded it, letting his keen eyes trace the ink. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he turned it toward them all. A financial record, a confession in ink. A direct link between Dr. Harrow and years of quiet, methodical embezzlement. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. He knew you were stealing from him. Harrow did not speak, but his silence was answer enough. Holmes watched him with quiet satisfaction. You orchestrated this, Doctor, not out of malice nor hatred. Holmes placed the document onto the table. But out of necessity, because Forsyth was on the verge of discovering your theft. Harrow remained still. Then, slowly, he exhaled. And with that breath, the last of his resistance collapsed. A long silence followed. Then, Harrow smiled. Not in victory, not in defeat, but in something colder, something resigned. So, what now? He asked. His voice was calm, empty. Holmes gestured toward the door. Scotland Yard awaited. Grayson stepped forward, his normally impassive expression tinged with something unreadable. Harrow turned to Holmes one last time. A final exchange. You of all people should know, Holmes, he murmured. His eyes gleamed. The mind is the cruelest prison. The words hung in the air, lingering long after the door shut behind him. And then, at last, silence. Chapter 6. The Haunting Truth. A final reflection. The great house stood in silence, not the tense, expectant silence of days past, but something heavier, something that lingered like a spectre in the air, pressing against the walls, slipping through the corridors. Watson moved through the now empty halls, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Dust motes swirled in the pale morning light filtering through the tall windows. Outside, the sky was washed in muted grey, as if the very world had dimmed in the wake of all that had transpired. The household, what remained of it, had gone. Grayson had vanished into his duties, Eleanor had retreated into herself, and Dr. Harrow. Watson shuddered, recalling the man's last words. The mind is the cruelest prison. For all their logic, their reasoning, their sharp deductions, the air in the house still felt charged with something unresolved. Watson turned, glancing at Holmes, who stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the fog roll through the grounds. Strange, Watson murmured. Holmes did not turn. What is? Watson inhaled deeply, looking around. For all our logic, I cannot shake the feeling that something remains unfinished. Holmes exhaled slowly, but he said nothing. The house, once filled with whispers, with unseen eyes lurking in the dark, was now only a shell. Yet Watson could not rid himself of the thought, some ghosts do not need bodies to haunt a place. Holmes gathered his belongings with quiet efficiency, his movements precise, methodical, deliberate. Watson, however, found himself lingering. His fingers trailed over Forsyth's desk, his gaze falling upon the faded imprints where letters once lay, letters that had sealed the man's fate. A man was killed, Watson murmured, and yet no one laid a hand on him. Holmes struck a match, lighting his pipe. The flame flickered, casting shadows against his face. "Belief is a sharper blade than steel, Watson," he said at last. Watson exhaled. He was a man already drowning in his own mind. Harrow merely let the tide pull him under. Holmes tilted his head slightly. "You are looking for meaning where there is none." Watson turned to him. "And what do you see, Holmes?" Holmes took a slow draw from his pipe, his gaze distant. "A man manipulated into writing his own fate." The words sat heavily between them. Watson looked down at the desk once more, his thoughts tangled. Could a man truly be murdered by an idea? Had Forsyth died the moment he believed in his own doom? Watson shook his head. He had seen men felled by gunfire, by blades, by sickness, but never before had he seen a man killed by a whisper in the dark. Perhaps that was why it unsettled him so deeply. The carriage waited outside. Miss Eleanor stood at its open door, her posture straight, her hands clasped before her. Watson noted the change in her, not merely the exhaustion that lined her face, nor the grief that sat behind her eyes, but something else, a weight, a realization. She was leaving. Leaving behind the house, the letters, the shadow of her cousin's ghost. Yet as she turned back one final time, her gaze lingered upon the windows of the great house. Her expression flickered, something unreadable in her eyes. Holmes watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "Will she be all right?" Watson asked quietly. For a moment, Holmes did not answer. Then softly, "No one leaves a story like this unchanged." The door to the carriage closed. The wheels groaned against the wet earth. And as the carriage disappeared into the London mist, the great house stood behind them, silent once more. Grayson stood at the doorstep of Forsyth's estate, his posture unyielding, his gloved hands folded neatly before him. Though the morning mist curled around the house, softening its once menacing edges, there remained a weight in the air, an unfinished whisper. Holmes, ever watchful, regarded the butler with his sharp, penetrating gaze. "You knew, didn't you?" Holmes said. "You suspected all along." Grayson did not answer immediately. He simply looked past them, as though watching something neither Holmes nor Watson could see. At last, he nodded. "The past never stays buried, sir." He turned his gaze to Holmes, his voice low, measured. "And neither does the future." Watson shivered, though the air was not cold. Before he could ask what the butler meant, Grayson stepped into the mist, his form swallowed by the grey veil of the morning. Holmes watched him disappear, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither he nor Watson spoke. Then, softly, Holmes murmured, almost to himself, "Curious." They were nearly gone. The case had been solved, the carriage awaited. And yet, Holmes stopped mid-step. Watson nearly collided with him. "Holmes, what?" But then he saw it. A single envelope. It lay atop Forsyth's desk, its wax seal unbroken. Watson exhaled sharply. "Another?" Holmes strode forward, lifting the envelope between two fingers. His keen eyes scanned the postmark, and something indistinct flickered across his features. Watson frowned. "What is it?" Holmes turned the envelope so Watson could see. The date. 1 week ahead. A silence settled between them. Watson hesitated. "Holmes, surely this is another trick. Another—" But Holmes was already breaking the seal. He unfolded the letter carefully. His eyes traced the words. Then, in a voice that did not waver, he read aloud, "Beware the man who watches from the fog." The words sent a chill through the room. Watson's throat felt dry. He swallowed. "What does it mean?" Holmes did not reply immediately. He merely stared at the words, his expression unreadable. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, thick as smoke. They stepped out into the street. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it had grown denser, alive, twisting, curling through the iron gates like spectral fingers. Watson turned to Holmes, waiting for him to dismiss the letter, to call it yet another deception, another manipulation of ink and mind. But Holmes said nothing. Instead, for the first time, he simply stared into the mist, silent. Watson followed his gaze, suddenly uneasy. Was someone truly watching? The fog swirled, a shadow shifted, and then, nothing. The moment passed, the street was empty, and yet, as they walked away, Watson could not shake the feeling that the case was not over, that something remained unseen, that perhaps, somewhere in the fog, the future still waited to be written.